Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Truth That Heals podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anthony Hernandez, and today I'm with a special guest with Lorwen Nagle. Thank you for joining us, Lorwen. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Ryan. Thank
So
you for having me.
it's an honor to have you on the show, and for those who are only listening, I just want to give a quick description because on the screen we have Lorwen, but in the background we have all these amazing paintings. And before we even get started, I just wanted to point that out that there's just amazing paintwork, artwork that's in the background. I'm very excited for this interview, but before we even get into all the paints, which I'm very excited to talk about, let's talk a bit about you. Can you introduce yourself, who you
Sure.
are, and what it is that you do?
I am a psychologist. So I got my PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. And I entered the doctoral program when I was 28. And so I got my doctorate by the time I was 32. And then I went on, actually, I ended up before that going to India with my boyfriend and going into Tibet. And I ended up getting altitude sickness on the other side of Mount Everest. And long and short of it is that we ended up meeting the Dalai Lama. So I that took my PhD in a different direction. So I ended up working with Tibetans and Tibetan refugees who came into the United States. Actually, I helped bring them in.
Okay.
So so that's some of my story. Um, and then I ended up getting a postdoc at Harvard in University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, so that's and I'm an oil painter and an acrylic painter. So that started later in my life. In 2002, I started painting and um, and doing that really part-time until at such time I started teaching that with another oil painter. So so my psychology degree and my psychology training has moved from private practice into oil painting and acrylic painting and back into private practice again. So I'm sort of and also working with refugees. So
So you sounds like you had a very busy life. I mean,
yes,
yeah.
it has been.
So what was it that sparked your interest to become a psychologist?
So I believe that began because I went through childhood issues, childhood trauma, actually, when I was 5 and 6 years old, that that affected me emotionally, and and also I was a very sensitive kid, and I think, and I was questing. I think that when we also have these disruptions in our life, it forces us to grow and to take a journey. And it's sort of like the hero's journey in many ways, um, that we get on this search. And I was a seeker. That's the best way I can say is that I was seeking answers and seeking for the truth. And I uh that's how I got into actually getting into the doctoral program, not something that I had ever envisioned. What I did is I started working with a man on with Hispanic alcoholics, and it was in San Antonio, Texas. And we published an article. It was the first article on Hispanic Americans. And and that's what put me into this doctoral program. So I didn't plan the doctoral program. It just sort of happened to me, which I was very happy to have it happen to me.
You're sharing how it brought you to Tibet.
Yeah.
Can you share what
Oh,
that was like?
that is an interesting thing because, see, from the time I was a kid, I always wanted to go to Tibet. I wanted, so in, so my boyfriend and I, so it was when we were 30, and um, and I said, let's go, because I was already what they call all but dissertation. Like I had everything, I'd passed all my clinical comps and all that kind of stuff. And I said, I want to go to Lhasa. And so we decided that we wanted to go overland, walk from it. There's something called the Friendship Highway, and it's from Nepal to Lhasa. And so that's what we did. So so it took us, actually, the Chinese government had, has took over Tibet in 1959. So it took a long time for us to get individual visas, but we ended up getting them after a month of working at it. And but then I got altitude sickness on the other side of Mount Everest. So and this French expedition came down from the base camp and said I had to go back into Nepal. And so I've never been to Lhasa. I've certainly been in Tibet, but I've never been to Lhasa.
And did you learn any wisdom from that trip? Or-
Oh, I think I learned a lot. Um, I uh, I learned a lot about courage, and I'd say surrender. Those are the two big things, because when I got sick, we just sort of there was a blown out hotel. So there was really no place to live or to stay. And so we stayed in this place, but I couldn't even stand up. And so there was a certain kind of serenity in me that I just kept relaxing and saying, okay, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And I think that provides uh, a certain, I don't know, it probably still stays with me today, that there's a certain kind of serenity in the face of sort of great forces, and that the best way to get through those challenging forces is to relax.
So after this trip in Tibet, did you stay there for 7 years, or how long were you there for?
So you remember that.
Okay.
4 days, I think, because 3 days I was sick. And so we come back in to Nepal, and so we decided to go see where the Dalai Lama was staying. So he was in a place called Himachal Pradesh, which is in India. And sure enough, I got an audience with him because I don't know. It's somewhat magical to be over in India and Nepal, and
Yeah.
or it felt that way, because somebody said, "Oh, I can find out how you can get an audience with him. You just need to write out your story." So I did a page, wrote out something, and sure enough, I was able to meet him personally, and that set a different course for my career, really. It set the journey in a different way because I represented them in Amnesty International. And I also um, started working with them as the psychologist for the Tibetans. So
Okay.
I went in India. I've been in India 7 times, which is a lot.
And so were you helping like the monks, the Tibetan monks, or?
Well, everybody know the whole. So what I did is I did a study which started with the Tibetans up in the Kulu Valley, which is up in the Himalayan mountains in Srinagar, and all the way down to the tip of India. So I'd go with I don't speak, I knew a little bit of Tibetan, but not speaking it fluently. So I'd have a translator and we would go through and look at the health conditions of the people in India, which enabled the then to come into the United States because of the certain health conditions that were it was India's a poor country. So what India gave them when they came in was the only thing that India could give them is, pieces of land but these Tibetans were not thriving very well. And it was nothing against India for sure. It was just the circumstance. So we put them in 21 cluster sites in the United States, which are still existing today, which is neat.
And while you were doing this, how did that experience change the course of your life?
I think it's informed me. I think it goes back to courage again. I was talking about an element of courage. Um, I was, when I did that study, I was in India for 9 months and I was alone as a single woman, pretty young, and I was just simply with Tibetans most of the time. I mean, there were some Westerners at the time, but not too many. And I think it taught me a lot of hardiness or resourcefulness and resiliency. I think those are the words that come to mind. I was even barred from coming back to the United States. So when in the final time, that one time of 9 months, um, the Indians in Delhi, they would not let me return to the United States. So my father went ballistic and called the senators and all these people. And that's how I ended up. I mean, I was in the embassy, but I was barred from leaving India for 2 weeks. So until finally some senators were able to get me out of India.
May I ask why were you barred?
Well, it was why it was on my passport in the back. I had brought a computer from Harvard for the Tibetans. They had a Tibetan hospital, and I had brought that computer in when I flew in. And it was located, and I had like a legal letter from the Dalai Lama, even,
Yeah.
I mean, that said this computer was for the hospital, but the Indians wouldn't take it. So there was all this whoop-de-doo and, and anyway, so I stayed in India.
So after that trip, now have you gone back since then, or was that your
No,
last? That was it.
well, oh, no, 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 no. I did went back once because I was um it was for the New York Times, actually. So a reporter named Kathy Rich called me from the New York Times, and she said that she wanted me to be her personal guide. So we went over for 2 weeks. That was my last time. And that went into the New York Times. So it was, yeah, that was 1999. So
Okay.
I have not
Yeah.
been I have not been back for many, many years.
But I see that it's really made a strong impression in your life,
Yeah.
not only your education, but also your the studies you did there in Tibet. And now that we know you a little better,
Yes.
I now want to direct our attention to what is childhood trauma, and if you can explain that to us.
Well, all right. So childhood trauma is when children are get into a situation. Most of the time, for instance, my childhood trauma was my mother was very neglectful of me. So we moved from at at 5 years of age, we moved to a large piece of land that was on a street with only boys on the block. And I played with these boys, but the boys got, it was very sexual and they were sexually abusive to me and they were older than me. And my mother was like non-compos mentis. She was not,
Mhm.
she was not there and she was unavailable and my father was gone too. So that's trauma to a child is when, and also I got a stick thrown like a spear went through my foot, my left foot. That was when I was 6. And all these things were traumatic experiences, which I later, it's only in my later life do I realize that all of those experiences were, and even my search in India. I mean, I went over there thinking we were traveling to Tibet. But as I said before, I think when we are, things get disrupted in our lives, we're forced to grow and we're forced to take a journey. And, much, I always equate it with the hero's journey because the hero's journey is one where you're seeking and you're out to find answers. And I think all through my life, I was seeking answers to what I believe was I was recovering what happened in my childhood. So
So,
that's, yeah,
so in your experience, after going through some unfortunate events, childhood trauma, you did have that openness to seek answers, and that led you to psychology and
yeah.
and also growth. And you're helping later on, you're helping people in Tibet, and you're going back and forth.
Right.
But what does it look like when people don't seek answers and they just uh, forget about it or pretend it didn't happen and it doesn't get resolved? How does that look like?
All right. So that's a good question, Ryan. Because I think what that looks like is that people get more sedentary. They get caught in. So we all, as humans, we have certain needs, and one of the needs is certainty. It's sort of paradoxical because we need certainty. We need to know that some of our beliefs are really right on and, something that we can lean on. At the same time, we like variety. We also need significance. We need to know that we're unique. And at the same time, we need to be connected with each other. And so I think when you're talking about what does it look like when somebody just doesn't doesn't want to seek answers. Uh, I think they get stuck in routines and I think they get, they sit and also I think when you don't force yourself to grow or feel the need to stretch yourself, that you get more fearful. I think that's also a condition that occurs. And so then your life becomes more narrow. I think when we stretch ourselves or push ourselves to take some steps outside of our comfort zone, outside of that certainty that we know, then we find new things.
What I'm feeling now, kind of when we're discussing childhood trauma when it's not getting resolved, is the opposite. There's like fear and there's like this holding on, holding
Right.
on to routines and, this fear of growth. Um, but when there's that fear of growth, and yet there is a desire to grow, it's hard. There's a
Well, I think you're right. We either grow or die, actually. I think growth is part of our spiritual need. Growth and contribution. Like what you're doing right now is you're contributing and giving back to others. And and I think that's a spiritual need that all of us have, is to give back. But we also have that spiritual need to grow. You say, what happens to those that don't want to grow, that want to sit uh, and what happens is it's not a great place. Um, because I think as humans, I think it's our nature to grow. I think for any living thing, it's its nature to grow, or it dies. Um, I mean, it's sort of black and white in some ways, like that.
Yeah. I was really thinking of my journey, especially after I left a toxic environment,
Yeah.
but after leaving, still mentally, I was not allowing myself to grow. I was seeing myself as guilty. I was seeing all of this shame. But then there came a point where I wanted to breathe. I wanted to have that freedom. But I think the scariest thing was to take that first step, because by taking that first step, I would have to acknowledge some of the past burdens. But as the steps went, as I was able to make a few more steps in life, then that burden kind of got lighter and lighter. And then ultimately, my goal is to let go and to go forward. And I'm learning
But
so much today.
what you're saying reminds me of the grief process, because in a way, and we all go through a grief process. When you were in this cult, you said it was an end times cult.
Yes.
Yeah. So there were certain beliefs in the cult, of the end times, I imagine, of that this is the way it was and the way it would, and yet you left it. You got in it and then you left it. But leaving it doesn't mean that, I mean, you were pushed out for some reason. In your own mind, you realized this wasn't right for you. Um, but in leaving, you still are grieving. You were grieving in a way. And that was part of that, like you're saying, that stage. But you mentioned a stage because you kept going through different stages, which I believe all of us move through. Now, one of those stages for somebody who's listening to the podcast can be one where you're just sitting there going, I just don't want to move. I don't want to, I don't want to go I'm not going to grow. But that's a stage in a transformation that's occurring. Um, and each one of us move through those stages in our own unique way, I think.
Yes, and it can be scary, and I know
Yeah.
people in the audience might be on their own journeys, but I always try to encourage that it is a journey, and but what I can say for myself, that it's been quite the adventure, and it's led me. I mean, first it was, getting involved in books, then going to some therapy, which at first seemed very embarrassing, but over time you starts to see, strengths evolving, and but those strengths were already there, and then
Yeah.
letting go. But then I took a path of trying to be artistic and creative, and it got me involved in, well, first I was, with a little pencil drawing on my little
Yeah.
sketchbook, and then I started writing, and then from writing I started just recording my voice and doing podcasts, but I was still afraid to show my voice, but then I mean to show my face. But then it evolved, and then I was able to do interviews with people and start doing YouTube. But it all started back, and you see how that journey goes. But I'm trying to connect this with art, and because I
Right.
I used, first for me, my voice was drawing. That was my voice, and then from there was writing, and then from there was just recording my voice, and then ultimately finding the courage to record my face. I mean, man, that was scary,
I
but
think that's beautiful.
but
But I think you're speaking, so I can relate to that artistic end. So what happened for me? So I told you in 1999 was the last time I ever went to India, and uh, uh, that was the finale. But I didn't know that that would be the last time. At least it is so far. Maybe I will go back. But within 2 years, I started picking up a brush. Now, what happened is that my husband gave me for my birthday, no, for Christmas. Christmas, he gave me this. There was a painting class in we live in these small towns in um, uh, in Maine. And so there was a little painting class. He gave me that, and that started this journey of my painting. And it went from there to meeting this guy who I ended up teaching with. Um, and we taught, and that was the podcast that I think you listened to.
sight
So
and insights.
Sight and Insight.
Yeah.
Yes. So David Curtis and I did a podcast, and I think we did 50 podcasts versions. And that was about art and psychology. And so we combined our artistic sensibilities because we were both painters, and we combined it with perception and all the psychological things, gestalt, how something, when you look at a painting, it sort of fits together, it has a good fit. And that all has to do with the psychological ways in which we perceive our world. And so we put that all together. It was a lot of fun. I mean, my God, it was fun, and it was so inspiring. And so also we taught. So during COVID, we taught through Zoom.
Mhm.
So we had these classes once a month through Zoom class. They were Zoom classes basically. And people would go out and they had their assignments to do these things, and then we'd have critiques. And but it was super cool,
Yeah,
But he died. He actually died an untimely death
mm.
a year ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to this podcast. I know it's finished, I'm assuming.
Yes, but I mean, we're not doing
Yeah.
it anymore.
But like it's for me, it is an art in a way, because art, even though the artist has many times maybe deceased, you can still behold the art and you can get your
Yes.
ideas, your thoughts, and it sparks discussion, or it sparks it sparks imagination. And as I'm listening to these episodes, there's a variety of episodes. um Even though he's already gone and he's passed on,
Wasn't he wonderful?
yeah, you can still, it's alive again. That's how
Yeah.
a podcast is, like a painting. It comes to life again. I kind of wanted now to ask you, how was it like for you working with David for the podcast?
It was great. Uh it was David's idea to do the podcast. And we'd get together, and because our relationship was very interesting. It was so we would we had a great relationship. We would spar, we compete with each other. And it was kind of it's very complex, many layers. We had a lot of fun together. um and uh and his wife was the one that would usually have the microphone ready for us, and then David and I would perform.
Yes.
And you're right. You're actually inspiring me to go back and listen to
Yeah,
it.
I was listening to quite a few, random, but
Yeah,
like I think one of the last ones I was listening to was regarding the seclusion of COVID. People are secluded, but with the podcast and with Zoom, how you're still connecting, and it's just inspiring. You hear episodes from the most recent to the oldest, and
yeah,
it is just an inspiring thing, and I'm glad you did it for
yeah. And
the time you did.
I'm glad that you are referring to it as a piece of art, because in a way it is.
I, that's how I try to treat my podcast,
Mhm.
as a form of art. And sometimes there are critics who, say you could do things better, and I get it. And sometimes I do take,
Yeah.
criticisms, but at the end of the day, I feel like it's an artistic expression. And but now I kind of want to direct my attention on, if you can walk us through, how is it that art, and there's a variety of expressions, but how, or creativity, how can this link with healing from trauma, particularly childhood trauma?
So, art, so back couple of at the beginning of our conversation, I talked about how art is sensual, and it's really a mind-body experience. So when I do these giant paintings that I have right now, um, they take a lot of energy and lots of, um, it's not just little dabs here and there. You're totally into it, and it's full body. And in that process, I think that you get outside of yourself. You're also, I in my current artwork, it is much more of the imagination. But even that, even I would say, even when David and I were talking about plein air painting, which means outdoor painting, um, and people try to confine their paintings to what they see. So they set up their easel outdoors. Maybe they're looking at the ocean or some scene, and then they try to replicate that scene the best they can. But in that process, there's a personality that shows up.
Mhm.
And that personality is also in the painting. And in that, you also I personally have experienced a certain kind of cathartic experience where I'm the process of painting actually heals because of the imagination. I think the base of it is in the imagination. There's a lot of neuro scientific evidence that uh, our our brains are really wired to all through this our brains throughout all the circuitry is into a more imaginative rendering of reality. Then we're our tendency is to say that's real, the trees out there are real, and whatever I'm seeing out there is real, I can touch it. But there's a tremendous amount of imagination that goes into how we anticipate what we're doing. And especially it's true when we paint or when we're creating a piece of artwork. So you ask about childhood trauma. It as when you receive trauma as a child, it's sort of the initial, it's when we are most vulnerable. And also the time when the potency of our experiences are most profound, because we're brand new. We're just little kids, and we have these experiences that we have, and then we make up beliefs about who we are in relation to the world and who we are in terms of our abilities to perform. And so I think when we start painting or doing any kind of creative act, like you said, you began with drawing, you are getting something concrete out of you, and putting it on paper or putting it on a canvas. And in that process, you can even step back, see what you've done, and kind of accept it. Like I love the fact that you said that people want to give you critiques on, how to do the podcast,
Yeah.
And that you recognize that there's an art form. And I totally agree with you on that. Like people want to say, well, you could do that painting a little bit differently, and you could, put a different light on it or something like that. But as I mature in my painting career, I realize that that you have to have a certain confidence also in the road, the avenue you're taking in your creative endeavor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I think that also feeds back to that courage,
Mhm.
that sense of courage that you can stand alone and stand out and take a certain stance. I'm not clear that my paintings are very good, but I'm not sitting there criticizing them either. I don't want to just
Yeah, well, like I recognize I'm still new,
yeah,
relatively. Like I didn't go to no school. I just started doing this. So
yeah,
some criticism I take it as advice, and it's like, okay, yeah, you're right. Like I can
yeah,
reshape this area, but at the end of the day, what I also try, going back to confidence, I'm the director.
yes,
It's like if I'm painting, at the end of the day, this is my painting. But I also need to have that openness. And if I'm, mistaken, okay, it's fine. Get the eraser. I know is there erasing in painting? Can you do that in painting? I don't think
well,
so.
you can paint over.
Or you can paint over.
Yes, paint over it.
But going back to what you're saying, it does have this like cathartic vibe to it,
Yes,
and that's what
yeah,
I'm so happy that you've shared. And you brought up something which I really liked about like how someone could be painting outside,
Yeah.
and what happens is you can see their personality in that painting. And I'm bringing that back up because you could have like in a studio, what do you call like those nude models, and
Yes.
you have 50 people. All right, let's draw this person, but I don't think every single drawing would be the same. And not that long ago, I think it was on Hulu, or I'm not
Yeah.
sure where I saw there's like this art show based off of UK where they have like models, and they have several different painters who are supposed to draw the same painting, the same object, but they're all different. You can see the
Yeah.
personality in each one, and it's just so beautiful to see how we're not all the same.
No. And that's the thing is that you could put an apple on a table and have the lighting so have, let's say, 10 artists circling it, and they would all paint that apple in a different way with different colors and different sensibility, different angles, everything. And yet you might say, okay, you guys paint exactly, and you've got the lighting right, just it's not changing and all that kind of stuff. But it will turn out different because every person is interpreting their reality in their own unique way, you know. And that gets back to that whole idea of what I was saying about how we we need to have in as far as human needs go, we need to be significant and unique, but we also need to connect, like again, like even the podcast, we're we're all like you and I are talking, other people are going to be listening to this. We're sharing and connecting at the same time. We're unique in our own way.
And kind of going back to something that you mentioned earlier was about, the soul. I think there's soul. I mean, yes, personality, expression, but the more soul, even in music, we see that there's, soul music.
Yeah.
It's something which I think for me, I didn't want to tap into,
Oh,
especially in the beginning, because I didn't want to acknowledge that trauma happened. I didn't want to acknowledge that bad things happened, and
right.
I just wanted to be plain, just go to work, go home. I didn't want to engage in conversations with people because I felt I was unworthy of that. Because
Yeah.
pre-cult Ryan, I was a very energetic, vibrant person. And
Yeah.
then after the cult experience, I felt like that died. But through art, I feel like it's resurrected. And not just art, but the therapy, and also, finding my healing and taking the time. I feel that Ryan who died spiritually is coming back to life, and now it's back to vibrant and happy me, and it feels good.
That is great. But what you're talking about is that cycle that I
Mhm.
think we all go through. And um, I think my cycle was different, and each one of us have different ways in which that cycle, uh, like you said, there was cult Ryan who
Yeah.
who was all fun and games and
Yeah.
and eager to learn and all this stuff. And then going into the cult was a trauma for you. And trauma meaning an emotional disruption. It did something, uh, but we grow from those emotional. That's the important thing to know, is that these things, when we're in it, I think we like you said, you came out of that and you didn't want to, you wanted to go to work and come home and not talk to anybody and not, not share. And because that's the place where you're kind of like mulching.
Mhm.
You're turning over these these things that didn't pan out. They were belief systems that you and also I think there's a bit of feeling betrayed.
Oh,
Uh,
yes.
there's a betrayal, and when we when we feel betrayed, and I felt that way when I was a child. I felt betrayed by my mother because she didn't defend me. And and so then you feel like you're on your own. And how come this happened to me? That kind of thing. And I know others can relate to that, you know, why it's where we feel victimized. It happened to us. But, and this is hard to grasp, but I'm going to share this
Mm.
is that life happens, and this is something I really feel strongly about. Life happens for us. I believe these things that happen that are difficult for us are also help us be who we are. It's not happening to us. It's not that we're a victim of life. Life is happening for us to grow, for us to develop, to change, to mature, to become even somebody that we didn't know we were or could be. That's the exciting thing, I think, about transforming trauma
Mhm.
into something that is power or powerful.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that's a very true yet overlooked statement that it can be transformed.
yes. And many times we use that word, I think it like a cliche, like, oh, it's transformative or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But but I don't mean it that way. I mean literally that we like I think in that process, I call it mulching. Like,
Mhm.
when you mulching some old stuff and you make good new soil, you're sitting there mulching this cult thing that happened to you, and then it turns into this nice moist soil that this podcast grew out of. So it becomes fodder. It becomes something food
Mhm.
for us to grow from, which is lovely.